I'm seeing it.
Oh, okay. That's good then. I will I don't oh, I see it. Perfect. Wonderful. Excellent. So then off we go. Uh the big picture is where I'm at now. The next slide down. Here's what I'd like to do for these talks. So I'm on slide 2. There we go. Here's what I'd like to do. Last time we talked about how to evaluate a moral action, and that included concepts like object, end, and circumstance. And we talked at the end about a tricky case, the case of double effect, where you have a single act which results in two different results, one of which is good, one of which is bad, and the conditions under which it's permissible to perform that act, given that you intend the good, but do foresee the bad as well. One thing I want to note about that checking every action like that, it can be morally exhausting. And it can be a way that's just impossible to live in real life. You can't go through your whole life checking every action before you perform it in this sort of deep manner. And happily, we don't need to do that sort of thing. We're creatures that can be what you might call habituated. We can get a stable disposition to act in a certain way. And so, for instance, you can be stably disposed to be courageous, to stand up to danger or difficulty for the sake of the good. And such stable dispositions are beneficial to us because they make what would otherwise be difficult and exhausting and not pleasant work of always evaluating as we go. It makes that sort of work easier, pleasant, even joyful. So today I want to talk about what those virtues are that help us to do the difficult or dangerous with ease and pleasure and joy. And next time, I want to talk about the conditions under which we acquire such virtues. There, I'll be pulling both from Catholic intellectual tradition, but also from contemporary psychological findings about the best ways to cultivate a virtue or to eradicate a vice. And then finally, the last thing we'll talk about at the final meeting are the main vices that get in the way, so to speak, that get in the way of our attempting to be virtuous. And those, of course, are what you might think of as the seven deadly sins or seven capital vices. So that's just the big picture, my plan for the whole. We're in part 2 now about virtue. And next slide will show the roadmap of things I want to talk about today. So today I'd like us to talk about how you define what a virtue is, what the cardinal virtues are, how they're distinguished from one another, some of the sub-virtues underneath the cardinal virtues, and what their parts are in a Thomistic sense. And finally, we'll give some examples of those virtues. The goal here is to expand our conceptual apparatus, make us better able to understand all the variety of virtues that there are. I myself find that sometimes we lack a term for a very important virtue in our lives. And lacking the word or concept for it, it's hard to form ourselves in accordance with it. And if you have people under your care, like I'm a father with 5 children, many of you will be priests one day and have people under your spiritual care. If you have people under your care, it's important to be able to form them using such concepts. I'm currently then on the slide labeled What is Virtue? And on that slide, I've got a definition composed of 3 essential elements. It says, as you can see, a virtue is a stable disposition that enables a person to act excellently regarding some kind or domain of activity. Those 3 components are underlined, and they each deserve a little bit of a conceptual analysis. By stable disposition, I'm thinking of it not as a one-off, not as a thing that's not common to the habits of the person in question. Even the most patient person will have a day where she might snap at somebody and be impatient. That's not showing her stable disposition. In fact, the only reason we can call it an uncommon occurrence is because she has a stable disposition the other way, and this is one of the outliers to it. So it's got to be a stable disposition, not an act, but that from which act flows. And it's got to be aimed at excellence to be a virtue. So There are many stable dispositions that aren't aimed at excellence, like cruelty. You might be a cruel person, and in that way not be acting toward excellence. And there are many neutral stable dispositions too. By neutral, I mean can go either way. Like tenacity can go either way. You can be tenacious for the good, which is an excellent thing for a person to be. And you can be tenacious in not cleaning your room, even though your father has told you kindly multiple times to do it. That's not an excellent way to be tenacious. So it's got to be aimed toward excellence. And finally, all virtues are about a specific sort of thing. Like perseverance is about obstacles, and sobriety is about intoxicants, and meekness is about your anger. So there's some realm of activity that virtue safeguards. In short, we might say they're good habits. That's a way of describing them. Okay, if we go to the next slide, slide 5 on the slide deck, you should be seeing St. Augustine of Hippo on there. I can't see myself what you have on the slide deck, but I'll just suppose that you do in fact have St. Augustine of Hippo there. Here's his definition of what a virtue is. But I guess before I give it, I just want to double make sure that I'm being heard because I'm still seeing the cat with the tail wagging. And I just want to make sure you guys on the other side of the world can hear the words I'm saying on this side of it.
We can hear you.
Okay, great. And you have the slide with St. Augustine up, is that right?
Is that? No, okay, yes, now I have it.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Here's what Augustine says a virtue is. Here's his definition of it. He says, virtue is a good quality of the soul by which we live rightly, of which no person can make bad use, which God works in us without us. And you see it's got 4 component parts there. It tells us it's a good quality of the soul. Goodness there tells us that it's aimed at good things. It also is a quality that's good for a person to have. It's not purely material. That's why it's in the soul. We see the efficient cause when we say that God works it in us without us. Those 2 middle parts it's a little perplexing, you might think at first, why you need both. Why do you have to say it's that by which you live rightly, but then also say it's that by which a person can't make bad use? You would think if it's what you live rightly by, of course you can't make bad use of it. And if you can't make bad use of it, of course it's that which makes you live rightly. And I think you need to include those 2. I think it's important for Augustine to include them both, and I'll say why. The thought is this. When you say it's that by which you live rightly, you're not necessarily yet saying it can only be used for good. So there are some features that you can live rightly by, but sometimes they're neutral, maybe sometimes toward evil. And likewise, there could be features that you make no bad use of, but they aren't quite good either. Maybe they're just neutral. So what we're looking for here with those 2 middle conditions are features that are aimed all and only toward the good. And I think a good way to capture that is to say it works for the good when you say it helps you live rightly. And you say it can't work for the evil, which is what you see when it says a person can't make bad use of it. When Aquinas considers this definition, as he does, and this is the next slide, Aquinas on the definition of virtue. When Aquinas considers this definition, here's what he says of it. He says, quote, "This definition comprises perfectly the whole essential notion of virtue," end quote. But he goes on to say, as Aquinas does sometimes, he goes on and says, quote, "Lastly, God is the efficient cause of infused virtue, to which this type applies. And this is expressed in the words, which God works in us without us. But if we omit that phrase, the remainder of the definition will apply to all virtues in general, whether acquired or infused." What's the idea? Well, for sure, for Aquinas, infused virtues, you could think of like the virtue of faith, for instance, but also the perfected 4 cardinal virtues. Those infused virtues are things that we don't earn or gain of our own accord. They're gifts from God. But Aquinas does admit the possibility of there being other virtues too, and he says of those, we can consider the acquired virtues and we can omit the God works in us without us portion of the definition. That's his take on it anyway. One final claim about the definition of virtue before I move on to talk about specific virtues and vices. It's on the Catechism of the Catholic Church. This is the 7th slide. You should be seeing a picture of the cover of the Catechism on the left side of the slide here. Here, the Catechism says, quote, human virtues are firm attitudes, stable dispositions, habitual perfections of intellect and will that govern our actions, order our passions, and guide our conduct according to reason and faith. They make possible ease, self-mastery, and joy in leading a moral life. The virtuous man is he who freely practices the good, and they're acquired by human effort. They are the fruit and seed of morally good acts, and they dispose all the powers of the human being for communion with divine love. End quote. Here, I think we see all the notions I've talked about previously coming together. We see it's a firm and stable disposition. We see that unlike having to think these things through each time we make an act, which would be difficult and not joyful, we see that the virtues provide ease and self-mastery and joy in leading the moral life. And we see that they can be acquired. They can be worked for us. And for next lecture, next week, I'll talk about some means by which to do that. But for today, I just want to talk about the analysis of the concepts of the virtues. Okay, so that's the definition I'm using. And the only part left of what I've explained so far to say a bit more about is the domain aspect. I've talked about stable, I've talked about excellence. Now I come to domain, the third part of the definition I gave. And so if you look at the next slide, on the left, you have the 4 cardinal virtues appearing to St. Jerome. And then on the right, you'll see it says virtue is divided by domain. And here are the general domains. Seeking the truth, you can do that excellently. And when you have a stable disposition to do that, you've got what we call an intellectual virtue. You can have doing the ethical good. That's a type or a domain. Of course, it's got many subdomains, but it's a type. And if you have a virtue with respect to doing that excellently, you've got what we call a moral virtue. And finally, you can have a virtue of relating to God excellently. That's a domain too. And we have a name for that domain as well. We call them theological virtues. For today, I'll say the teeniest bit about intellectual and theological virtues, and then hone down even more just to the cardinal virtues. So the next 4 slides will come in rapid succession because they're just charting things out for us. But you should see a slide now that says character traits on the left, and it's got stable dispositions up on top. And you can subdivide dispositions by what they're aimed at, the good, the neutral, or the bad. Under the good, you might have moral, intellectual, and theological. And of course, it goes down and down and down. So you can have moral virtues like temperance, fortitude, justice, and prudence. That's on the slide that says moral virtues on the left. You can have the intellectual virtues, some of which on the next slide are listed: honesty, studiousness, open-mindedness, and intellectual charity. And finally, you can have the theological virtues. And those include, of course, faith, hope, and love. So what I've done, at least for this first part of the talk, is start wide with the definition of what a virtue is, give 3 elements of that definition, and then speak about each of those 3 elements, finally getting to examples of underlying virtues like faith, hope, and love. For the next part of the talk, and starting on the next slide, which says the parts of virtue, I want to talk about Aquinas' understanding of different notions of the parts of virtue. So those include the following, and here's a quote which we'll unpack as we go. Aquinas says, quote, this is on the slide, he says, quote, parts are of 3 kinds, namely integral parts, as a roof or a wall or foundations or parts of a house. Subjective parts, as ox and lion are parts of animal, and potential parts, as the nutritive and sensible powers are parts of the soul. Accordingly, parts can be assigned to virtue in 3 ways. So we're going to talk about those 3 ways of having a part. And eventually we're going to focus on the last 2. But I thought I can't just tell you about the last 2 and not say anything about the first one. You'll wonder what's the first one. So here I'll say a bit about the first one too. Look at the next slide. It says integral parts, and you should be seeing a picture on the right of a house diagram. Hopefully you're seeing that picture up there now. Here's what Aquinas says about what integral parts are. He says, first, in likeness to integral parts, you can talk about the parts of virtue, so that the things which need to concur for the perfect act of virtue are called the parts of that virtue. Just like in a house, to get a house, you need a roof and a wall and a floor. And just like a roof, a wall, and a floor each individually aren't their own house, so likewise, in virtues, you need some actions or parts that are included, which aren't themselves virtues. What are some examples? Well, Aquinas, and this is the next slide, slide 15 on the slide deck, examples of integral parts. Aquinas lists, just as an example, 8 integral parts of prudence. The idea here is to be prudent, you need to have a functional memory because you have to remember the evidence that you've come to have about the decision you're going to make. You need to be able to reason with respect to those memories that you have. You need some understanding for unpacking the concepts. You need what he calls docility so that you can learn from others things. You need shrewdness, which is the ability to reason well in his account. It's understanding the middle term of a syllogism is what he says. You need some foresight to understand what's going to come about as a result. You need some circumspection to consider the consequences and surrounding circumstances of the action. And you need some caution too. I'm not going to list all the integral parts of all the virtues, but I thought it'd be useful to give one set of examples of what integral parts are. And so the basic idea here is just an integral part is itself not a virtue, but it's some activity or thing needed to do the virtue well. Next, we have subjective parts, and this will be important for what follows. On the subjective parts slide, slide 16, you'll see there on the right a series of genus and species and subspecies. And it's just a hierarchy. It's like a Porphyrian tree. Aquinas says, quote, the subjective parts of a virtue are its various species. And so here we can think just like you can have the genus animal, and it subdivides between mammals and reptiles. And mammals, of course, subdivide between cats and dogs and so on and so forth. So likewise with virtues. And the important thing to note here is, just as mammals and reptiles are animals in the fullest sense of the word, and cats and dogs are animals in the fullest sense of the word, so likewise the subjective parts of virtues are virtues in the fullest sense of the word. What's an example here with respect to virtue? Here's what Aquinas says about prudence on the next slide, slide 17. He says, quote, in this way, the parts of prudence, if we take them properly, are the prudence whereby a man rules himself, and the prudence whereby a man governs a multitude. Again, the prudence whereby a multitude is governed is divided into various species according to the various kinds of multitude. So in that picture, you see prudence on top, divided between ruling of self and ruling of others. And as he says, the ruling of others is subdivided by what type of community or multitude is being ruled. So you can rule an army is one example he gives. You can rule in a house, that's domestic prudence. In a society, he says there's a virtue of ruling the others and a virtue of being ruled well. And he distinguishes those two in society. The important thing to note here, though, is that each of those italicized lowest level boxes is itself a virtue on Aquinas' view. It's a subjective part, and subjective parts themselves are virtues. Okay, final distinction of parts. We get potential parts, and this is slide 18. He says, quote, the potential parts of a virtue are the virtues connected with it, which are directed to certain secondary acts and manners, not having, as it were, the whole power of the principal virtue. Here, you'll see the top part is the same picture as the subjective parts. But on the bottom, I've added those two other related species, C and D. And you'll see two important features. One is they're not connected by any lines to the hierarchy, so they're not strictly speaking part of the hierarchy above. And two, I've demarcated them with a little bit of a different color, some orange hue in them to represent it not having the whole power of the principal virtue. There's important relations there to the principal virtue, but it isn't itself a subjective part of it. What are examples of that? Well, here's what Aquinas says with examples. And at this point, we're mostly coming to the end of long quotations from Aquinas. So sorry about all these long quotations. But he says, quote, "In this way, the parts of prudence are good counsel, which concerns counsel, synesis, which concerns judgment in matters of ordinary occurrence, and nome, which concerns judgment in matters of exception to the law, while prudence is about the chief act, that is commanding." What's going on in this text? Well, I think of it like this. The main thing prudence does, on Aquinas' view, is command. It's a command of acts, what you're going to do. And it's true that judging the matters in ordinary occurrence isn't itself a command. To judge is distinct from commanding. And so judging isn't quite fully under prudence as a subjective part. But it sure is closely related because you have to make the judgment well to make the command well. And so while these three aren't themselves parts of prudence in the proper sense of the term, they're still closely related. They still have some of the relevance of prudence in them. And that's why they're potential parts. They don't belong in the tree, properly speaking, but they're super closely related. I like his thought of including a nome here, and it's interesting that he, even in the Latin, if you go back and look at Aquinas, I don't think he gives you a Latin. I think he just gives you what the Greeks said there. So I think it shows maybe the Latins themselves didn't have a good word for it. I'm not sure in contemporary English we have a good word for this particular virtue. But I like the thought of there being judgments in matters that accept the law. And I think in this case of, I have 5 children, and there have been evenings where I've rushed to a hospital, well, especially when my wife was giving birth. I'm driving through a snowstorm for my daughter Mary, and you get to a red light and you're sitting there and nobody else is on the road, but the light is red and nobody's on the road and nobody in the car is calm. And the question is, what do you do in the situation? There's nobody around I'm going to hit with my car. It's not like I'm being uncautious or endangering anybody. In that sort of situation, there's a good in being able to judge well with respect to this situation that's out of the ordinary. And that's what he calls nome here. My wife, of course, was like, look, just go, because she's much more prudent than I am. But so she saw immediately the thing to do in the situation. Okay, by way of summary, and now we're on slide 20. Just by way of summary, we've got integral parts. Those are necessary constitutive conditions for the virtuous activity. We've got subjective parts. Those are sub-virtues on the tree like I gave. And then we've got potential parts which are virtues, aren't on the tree, but are closely related to it. What I'm talking about for the remainder of this is going to be subjective and potential parts. The next slide starts the discussion of prudence. And in fact, since all of my examples have been examples from prudence, I'm going to be lighter on prudence, say less about it than I will about the other ones, because I've already said a fair bit by way of examples of parts with prudence. So if you're on slide 21 now with prudence, you'll see it starts with a quotation from Aquinas that describes prudence as, quote, "its right reason applied to action." And then again, there's a quotation from the Catechism. "Prudence is the virtue that disposes practical reason to discern our true good in every circumstance and to choose the right manners of achieving it." Now, there's different domains, like I mentioned earlier. Domains or spheres of prudence, and this is slide 22. I've given those already. The personal prudence we have when we rule ourselves well, domestic prudence when we rule a household well, governing prudence where we rule society well, military prudence where you rule an army well and command the army well. On the next slide, you'll see virtues that are related to prudence. So you can have those 3 that I just mentioned earlier in nome that I talked about too. Those are all not properly speaking under prudence, but they're potential parts of prudence. On the next slide, slide 24, you'll see I've got a slide that's mostly empty. There's a table there, but nothing really filled into it. And that's because I'm going to use this sort of strategy to provide examples of virtues and vices. And for each, you see there's 4 columns here. There's a type of activity, a thing that you're doing. There's the virtue of excellence with respect to it. That's the mean. And then for each type of activity, you can do it, in a sense, too much or too little. You can be deficient in the doing of the activity, or you can be excessive in the doing of the activity. Examples? Look at slide 25, and you'll see the examples. So in your deliberation, you might be considered. That is to say, you might consider enough, but not overthink it. To be considered is the excellence, but the negligence with respect to prudence would be being impulsive. And what if you do it too much? What if you deliberate not the prudent amount of deliberation, but you deliberate way more than you need to? We call that being an overthinker or overthinking things. I have a friend who's got a coffee mug that says, "Hold on, let me overthink that." And I think that's exactly right for her. So we have these different virtues and vices and how they relate to each other on this slide here. Or just skipping to the bottom one, in deliberating the value of options, part of making a prudent decision is weighing the value of the options ahead of you. And sometimes you can underappreciate certain options. Maybe when you're young and you really want to be cool, you bully other kids in the hopes of getting some street cred or some more cachet with your other students. In that case, you're probably overvaluing the importance of coolness in school, and you're undervaluing the importance of that kid's emotional health because you're being rude to that child. Okay, go on to justice. Justice on slide 26. What is it? Well, it's a habit whereby a man renders to each one his due by a constant and perpetual will. That last part, constant and perpetual will, why is it there? I think it's there because we want it to be a stable disposition, and that's one way of signaling that it's stable. It's not just a one-off, an individual act. And what's the Catechism say? It says, justice is the constant and firm will to give their due to God and neighbor. Again, we can talk about the spheres or domains. So this is number 27, slide 27. There's different domains of justice. There's justice between individuals, commutative justice. And that's if, say, if I promise to pick you up from somewhere and drive you to church and I break that promise, I've gone against justice in the commutative sense, especially if I broke it for a trifling reason, like I wanted to sleep more, so I overslept it. There's legal justice, not between me and you and society, but between the society and me. And then there's distributive justice, like what's the right amount of sharing for the goods that we have? What's the wrong amount of me keeping goods away from you? Again, we can talk about some virtues related to it. This is slide 28, and I won't read the whole definition of each one, but the virtues of things like honesty. So telling the truth, giving the right truth in the right way at the right time. Or affability, being pleasant and warm in situations that don't necessitate the contraries. Sometimes being pleasant and warm isn't the right way to be, given the situation at hand. Maybe a judge giving a sentence to a convicted killer shouldn't aim at being affable, pleasant, and warm during the situation. But the idea here is that the situation he's in necessitates the contrary of it. Or filial piety, an important notion in the East especially, of rendering to one's parents their just due. On the other hand, if those are virtues that go along with justice, we have some vices that are related to justice too. And this is slide 29 in the slide deck. So you can have the vice of backbiting. You speak unnecessary ills about somebody, even whether they're true or not. I say unnecessary there because sometimes it's important for you to speak the truth about somebody's foibles to somebody else. Detraction is when you speak the truth, but you speak it intending to unnecessarily bring dishonor to the person. Again, sometimes it's important to speak the truth that's dishonoring of a person if you're trying to protect other people. But in that case, you might think it's necessary to do such a thing. And finally, hypocrisy is a vice of attempting to seem better in some way than you in fact are. And that's contrary to justice too. It's giving yourself more than you deserve. On the next slide, slide 30, just like previously with prudence, you see there, I've got, again, the examples laid out, and you've got affability, for instance, the virtue in the middle, and you've got coldness, which is a deficiency of social warmth, and you've got what you might call flattery, which is excess of social warmth. I find it interesting that for some of these terms, we don't know what to call it. So, for instance, filial piety, the virtue of giving to your elders, especially your parents, what's due to them. What do we call the excess or deficiency of filial piety? Maybe we have a word for it and I don't know it, but I think we don't have a word for it. And if we don't have a word for it, it's hard for us to be able to educate those under our care and ourselves as well about the goodness of this virtue and tell us what to watch out for in its excess and deficiency. All right, the next two I'll discuss sort of as a package deal at first. The last two cardinal virtues are temperance and fortitude. And it's important to point out for temperance and fortitude, there's a similarity between them, but a difference too. And the similarity is this, or let's start with the difference. If you look at the quotation from Aquinas on slide 31, you'll see he says, quote, "There's a logical difference between temperance and fortitude, even if we take them both as general virtues. Since, and here's the important difference, since temperance withdraws man from things which seduce the appetite from obeying reason, while fortitude incites him to endure or withstand those things on account of which he forsakes the good of reason." So there's a difference between the two, and it's an important difference. They both have to do with your appetites, but the difference between the two is what's happening with you with respect to the appetites. Are the appetites enticing you away from what you should be doing? Are they seducing you and pulling you toward it? If so, the virtue needed to withstand that is temperance. Are the appetites instead enticing you away, pushing you away from doing the thing you want to do? Is your fear making you want to flee, and right reason requires you to stand firm? There you have to fight against your appetites, not fighting them to not eat, but fight to stay away. That would be fortitude. If you look at the next slide, slide 32, I asked, of course, our AI overlords, I asked them to give me a representation of this. And so we have there what it would look like for temperance when you are being seduced by the good of an appetite into disobeying reason. And she's got a cake there that says "eat me" on it, if you're looking at the right slide, slide 32. And I don't know how they cut such a big piece of cake out and it turned to be so small when they finally put it on a fork, but there you have it. And it turns out she is so enticed by this cake that says "eat me," that she hasn't even noticed that phantom hand hanging out on the right of the picture behind the arm. You see that weird hand that got added there? Or again, if you look at the next slide, slide 33, fortitude incites him to endure or withstand those things on account of which he forsakes the good of reason. Well, of course, it's never a good idea to wrestle a bear. But if it's you and your two daughters out for a walk and a bear comes up, there's only one person who should be trying to face the bear while others get away, and of course, it's the dad. So he's got to gird himself up to endure or withstand the difficult. And doing that well requires some fortitude. Okay, so a bit more about fortitude, and then finally a bit more about temperance, and then we'll be done. With respect to fortitude, it's a stable disposition. This is slide 34. A stable disposition of a fortitude is a stable disposition of firmness only in bearing and withstanding those things wherein it is most difficult to be firm, namely grave danger. That's what Aquinas says. And what's the Catechism say? It says, "Fortitude is the moral virtue that ensures firmness in difficulties and constancy in the pursuit of the good. It strengthens the resolve to resist temptations and to overcome obstacles in the moral life." All right, fighting difficulties like bears. We have next on slide 35 the spheres of fortitude. Just like for all the other virtues, we saw there's domains which they're relevant to. So likewise with fortitude. You can have fortitude in battle. You can have fortitude in persevering intellectually. Like when you're learning a new language, it's difficult. You want to give up, but you stay firm. You can have fortitude when you have constancy in your physical training. You can have fortitude in your patience in overcoming the sorrows you feel. Examples of fortitude then would be things like, and this is slide 36, your patience, your perseverance, and your magnanimity. Those are all different ways to have fortitude because they're all different domains that you're excellently standing up to with resolve. Okay, so just like previously on slide 37, you'll see a table, and that table provides us with those three virtues I just spoke about: magnanimity, patience, and perseverance. And I won't go into it now just for interest of time, but you'll see on the deficiency side and the excessive side different vices associated with it. So, for instance, if you lack perseverance, you might be irresolute. And if you tenaciously fight against the difficulties and obstacles far past when it's reasonable to do so, you might have what we call intransigence, or you might be obstinate. Slide 38 is one of my favorites, but I'm going to skip it. But I just want to point out to you that in slide 38, we have Aquinas's conceptual distinctions between different types of fortitude with respect to enduring a difficult thing. And it's so nicely done. I love when Aquinas gets architectonic, when he gives you the whole system worked out, and you can find it there on that slide. Finally, with respect to temperance, and now we're at 39, slide 39. With respect to temperance, Aquinas says, quote, temperance is about the greatest pleasures, which chiefly regard the preservation of human life, either in the species or in the individual. And the Catechism says, quote, it's the virtue that moderates the attraction of pleasures and provides balance in the use of created goods. So that's what temperance is supposed to do. Like we saw earlier, it's what helps us not be seduced by the goods that we're allured to. What are some spheres of temperance or domains? Well, on slide 40, you see food or intoxicants or even the admiration of others. It's intoxicating to be praised by others, and it's a dangerous thing for us to be so intoxicated by their praise. What are some virtues related to temperance? We're on slide 41 now. We've got sobriety. That's a virtue related to temperance. That's a reasonable moderation of intoxicants. We've got studiousness. That's a reasonable moderation of our desire for knowledge. And we've got modesty. That's a reasonable moderation of our activities done for the sake of the esteem of others. How are those related to their vices? Well, on the next slide, slide 42, you'll see some different ways of understanding those vices. So, for instance, with respect to humility, concerning the esteem of others, you might have a false modesty when you're deficient with respect to it. But if you're overly excessive in your desire for the esteem of others, we might say that you have vainglory. Or how about being studious? Studious is a fun one because today, at least in American English, we'll use the word curious for what Aquinas meant by studious. Studiousness for Aquinas was when you're properly motivated to look into truths. And so it's like a detective could be studious when he's trying to solve the crime, and Aquinas' use of the word studious. But nowadays, studious means what? Being a really good student in school, studying well for tests. And that's not the notion that Aquinas had for studiousness. I think today we would say that curious is that notion, but funnily enough, the Latin for curious is the word he would use for the vice. So it's just a case where you have to be very careful when you're translating 750 years after the writing, when you're translating what he's saying, because it could sound like he's saying being curious is a vice, curious in our current sense, And that sounds like saying to kids, don't you think hard about what the world is like. Just obey and respect what we say. But that's not at all what he's saying. He's saying that the problem is being what you might call voyeuristic or desiring too much knowledge or knowledge of the wrong types. I think of those cases where you have reporters that dig through the trash of a celebrity's house to try to see what sort of medicine the celebrity's children take and then publish it in a tabloid newspaper. And I think that's a case where they're curious in the very wrong sense of the word because they want to know things that's not any of their business. So those are different vices associated with those virtues underneath temperance. In sum, then, this is slide 43. In sum, we've got these four cardinal virtues. We've got the four things that they're aimed at: deliberation about things that are good and beneficial for prudence. We got desire to partake of the good and pleasant for temperance, desire to avoid the dangerous and difficult for fortitude, and giving and receiving what is owed for justice. And for each of these virtues, you can distinguish the deficiency, doing that thing too little, like when you're impulsive or when you're a coward, from the excess, doing that activity too much, like when you overthink the situation, or when you're reckless or foolhardy, standing up to dangers that it's stupid to stand up to. Virtue doesn't require us to be stupid. And so if fortitude for you looks like being dumb, it's not really fortitude that you're having. Okay, so then in sum, slide 44, in sum, what have we done? I've talked about how to define virtue. I've given three essential features of it: the stable disposition toward excellence with respect to a domain. I've talked a bit more about each of those three features, quoting the Catechism and Aquinas as well to shape them up. I've then talked about what the parts of the cardinal virtues are, or parts of virtues in general. You got integral parts, subjective parts, and potential parts. I talked about what those four cardinal virtues are and how they're distinguished from each other, given some examples of the domains which they govern, and also some examples of the virtues that fall underneath each of those cardinal virtues. And that's it for me today. Thank you very much.